Welcome to the Real News Network, coming to you from Washington, D.C. We're at America's Future Now conference. And we're now joined by Anand Gopal. He's a journalist who covers Afghanistan, but was before that a physicist living in New York City. Thanks for joining us. So just quickly, get us why you left being a physicist and how you get to Afghanistan.
Well, I was living across the street from the Twin Towers in New York on 9/11 and saw the attacks there and had a few of my close friends killed in the attacks. And since that day, I've been very interested in what's happening in the region in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And eventually I decided that I wanted to go out and see it for myself and report for myself.
So one of the big debates that took place around covering 9/11 within those days, just afterwards, that if you tried to connect what happened on 9/11 to U.S. foreign policy or to root causes, you were accused of blaming the victims and capitulating to terrorism. So I think it's pretty clear for everybody now that there were root causes to all of this. Has anything in terms of U.S. policy changed in any fundamental way that gave rise to the conditions that gave rise to Taliban, Al-Qaeda in the first place?
Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like anything has really changed in terms of U.S. policy in this respect. Right now, the U.S. is fighting counterinsurgency in Afghanistan, and every day they're creating new Taliban and new insurgents because of military actions. And this is some of the similar things that have happened before 9/11 as well. So we haven't seen a sort of fundamental shift.
So with the troop surge, we're told that there's a new plan's going to take place, which is going to combine more soldiers, but what they're calling a civilian surge. Although one of the things I think that stood out is that candidate Obama promised something like a Marshall Plan for Afghanistan, and we're not hearing any of that kind of language now when it comes to kind of a serious effort for reconstruction. So what is happening in terms of the surge, and what do you think is likely to be the outcome?
Right now, the majority of the new strategy is completely military. So we've seen 21,000 more troops coming this summer. 3,000 have already landed and they've been here for 6 months. We've seen very little of what Afghans ask for a lot, which is a sort of emphasis on reconstruction and development and strengthening civil society and seeing more of an emphasis on the military. I think this summer we're going to see a lot more violence. Every year has been more violent than the previous year, and this year looks like it's going to be a record year again.
Well, I was there making a documentary film in spring of 2002. And at that time, I heard two things up and down the country, including Kandahar, but throughout the country. Number one was reconstruction. Number two was disarm the warlords. Neither of those things really seem to have happened. But we were promised a new mindset by the Obama administration. Do you get an indication of a new mindset?
I get an indication that people in the administration are thinking hard about how to change the strategy, but people in Afghanistan feel like the strategy fundamentally hasn't changed. They feel it's an intensification of what's come before. So more troops, more military spending, not a sort of break. And it's interesting because Obama has said publicly that there's not a military solution to the conflict. There's a political solution to the conflict, yet the actual on-the-ground strategy is a military strategy.
So the question I'm going to ask you, I'm sure is a very complicated answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway, and it's because it sounds like a simple question. The thing that doesn't get discussed here very much is, what do Afghans want in this scenario, and what sense do you get of that?
Right, this is the key question, and I think there's no easy answer. Afghanistan right now is divided along ethnic lines, roughly between the north and the south. In the northern areas where there's minority groups, by and large, people there are friendly to the American presence, and they want the Americans there. They view them as a buffer between them and the Taliban. The Taliban committed many massacres and atrocities in these areas during their regime. In the southern areas, where the war right now is actually being fought, in the Pashtun areas, most people don't want the troops there. And this is very different from 8 years ago. I mean, across the board, most Afghans welcomed us with open arms 8 years ago. But
yeah, when I was there, including the Pashtun areas, there was a real openness to reconstruction, and people were, in fact, I was told by one journalist that there were meetings of the Loya Jirgas, the councils of elders, that had actually met and asked the Taliban, lay down your arms or leave, and then about a year and a half, 2 years ago, they were invited back in again.
That's right, yeah. I mean, people were tired of the Taliban rule. There were no jobs. There was security, but there was no jobs, no prospects for improving your life whatsoever. So people really welcomed the Americans. Americans came into the country, made a wide array of promises. You know, they promised the jobs. They promised to, well, not reconstruction, because the country's never been developed in the first place. They promised to develop it. They promised to build roads and schools and these sorts of things. And they promised peace and security. And especially in the southern areas right now, a lot of Afghans feel that those promises haven't been met. And so you have a lot of Afghans that are disillusioned and see that the Americans have come here with empty promises.
So, if when you talk about people in the north still wanting some kind of buffer with the Taliban, on the other hand, you have Karzai talking about wanting the Americans to stop bombing, which represents whatever Karzai really means about all of that. It certainly represents Afghan public opinion. So, do people feel like they're caught between a rock and a hard place here, and is there some sense of a movement within Afghanistan that's independent both of the warlords and of the Western U.S. forces?
Yeah, Afghans certainly say that they feel like they're caught between a rock and a hard place. In a lot of places, there's not a lot of deep support for the Taliban, but there's even less support for the U.S. forces, especially when there's civilian casualties and other sorts of things. So people will say, well, the Taliban are the lesser of two evils, or the Taliban, well, they're one of us, so we can deal with them. We don't want to deal with the foreigners, they're not one of us. So sort of the Taliban has been able to come back into power sort of, by default. But because
even in Kabul and northern parts of Afghanistan, or this you're talking about the south?
I'm talking about the south. In the northern areas, it's different. We still have warlords, pro-government warlords, basically control these areas. There is a little more development and reconstruction and these sorts of things happening in the north. But at the same time, people are fed up with the way the country's going, because it's still one country, and overall things are not going in the right direction. So they are fed up, and they don't feel like there is an alternative. Unfortunately, there isn't at this point an independent alternative apart from the warlords or the various insurgent groups. And this is because the country is extremely underdeveloped. Civil society exists mainly within the major cities. In the poor villages, there's no civil society, let alone there's no electricity, roads, or anything like that. So whoever has the guns basically commands the day.
Well, one of the strategies that's being talked about, and I guess they've started to implement it, is the sort of Iraqi Awakening Council type of formations, where the U.S. will fund kind of militias to fight the Taliban. Where is that at, and what are the consequences of that?
Well, they've started this in the last 3 months in one province called Wardak province. It's sort of a pilot program, and they want to see if it succeeds there to extend it across the country. Now, there's a fundamental difference between the program that's in Iraq and the one in Afghanistan. In Iraq, the U.S. was able to bring aboard Sunni tribesmen to fight against an outsider, or a perceived outsider, which is Al-Qaeda. In Afghanistan, that dynamic doesn't exist because the Taliban are part of the community. They're the sons and the brothers and the cousins of the people of the villagers. So it's not easy to actually separate the tribes and the villagers from the Taliban. And so it will be very difficult to get them to fight. And I was actually in Wardak province reporting on the progress of these militias, and this was the case, in fact. They had a lot of difficulty getting tribesmen to sign up for the program. Most of the tribes said, we don't want anything to do with it. So you got a few of these pro-government minority groups, which are mostly in the north, but a few in small communities in the south, which joined the program. But the Pashtuns, by and large, have not joined the program. So now what we're having is the Americans are arming one ethnic group against another ethnic group. And with a country that's had a history of civil wars and internecine warfare, this is a very dangerous recipe.
When you interview people in Kabul, people who haven't been there don't realize how many educated, sophisticated people there are in Afghanistan. What if they were to say what they want in terms of some programmatic solution? What is it?
I asked this question to an Afghan lawmaker a few months ago when the debate here about whether we should increase troops is in full gear. And she told me, I asked her, well, Obama's thinking of sending up to 30,000 troops to your country, and what do you think about that? She told me, we don't want 30,000 troops. If you're going to send anything, send us 30,000 doctors or 30,000 engineers, 30,000 experts to help train our people. And I think by and large, Afghans want development and they want job opportunities. And they'd like to see a shift away from a military emphasis and towards more civilian reconstruction sort of emphasis.
But there is a security component to that, isn't there? Because Taliban do kill doctors and teachers. I mean, at least they were targeting people who were involved in reconstruction. I mean, is that still the case? And how do you balance this issue of more doctors, more teachers with the security issue?
Yeah, it's certainly a challenge, but one of the reasons the insurgency was able to rise in the first place is because people felt dissatisfied with the lack of the development and these sorts of things. So it's possible that these tribesmen that are harboring the Taliban, it's possible for them to say, okay, listen, we won't let the Taliban stay in our communities if you can actually develop our communities. Okay, because ultimately, as any insurgency, the success of an insurgency depends on the population in which it's embedded. So it has to have support of the population. The Taliban wouldn't exist if it didn't have a degree of support. It may not be full support saying we want you back in power, but at least tolerance. And that's what the Taliban has right now. So it's up, counterinsurgency doctrine talks about trying to sway the population away from the Taliban.
Well, in the next segment of our interview, let's talk about what's happening in Pakistan and how it affects the situation in Afghanistan, and a little bit more about what solutions might be possible. Please join us for the next segment of our interview with Adam Kubal.